2063's research on the impact of the Ukraine crisis on African economies. Please head to the chat, tell us your name, tell us the organization you represent, tell us what you expect to see during this session. Our theme for today is the transmission of global price shocks to local commodity markets in Rwanda. And we are looking forward to a highly interactive, highly engaging conversation with you all. As always, we are providing simultaneous interpretation in English and French. Please click on the globe icon on your screen if you need that function. And we are live streaming on our YouTube channel. Remember to drop your questions in the Q&A chat, not the general chat, the Q&A. Any questions, observations, remarks you have, please take them to the Q&A and the moderator will bring them to the floor during the conversation. And of course, if you wish to intervene live, you are welcome to raise your hand and you will be given the floor. Now that the housekeeping is out of the way, please permit me welcome our moderator of today's session. He is Senior Technical Advisor to the Elder Directorate of Program Innovation and Planning on Food Systems, CADAP and Rural Futures Programs, Dr. Hamadi Diop. Over to you.
Dr. Laye, thank you for the introduction. So I am connecting here from Indonesia, so don't ask too many questions about my hat. It is a part of the custom and the tradition here. So today we will be engaging in one of the webinar on the Ukraine series webinar. As you know, Ukraine crisis has many impacts on a different level. Ukraine and Russia produce a lot of agricultural commodities that are being purchased by many African countries. So today we will have a kind of case study on Rwanda and looking at how the Ukraine crisis is impacting basically the Rwanda commodity prices. We will have a very good guest, Dr. Paul Maina Gutiga, who is a seasoned researcher who holds a PhD in agriculture economics, who also works for academia, who has interest in trade, in natural resource management. But today his interest will go into a very specific area in looking at price commodity in Rwanda and looking how the global shocks of the Ukraine crisis are impacting the daily life of Rwandese. So without further ado, let me hand the floor to Dr. Gutiga. So give him about 20 minutes to present us the finding of his research. Dr. Gutiga, you have the floor.
So thank you very much, Hamadi, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone joining us. So let me begin by sharing my screen. Okay. I hope and presume that everyone now can see my screen. So thank you for the introduction. Yes, as mentioned by Lai, this presentation is one in a series that is specifically on the impact of Ukraine crisis and particularly on commodity prices in Rwanda. And this work was done early and middle part of last year when the crisis began. As you know, the invasion began around February, and immediately there was some ramification on trade of major commodities that were being transmitted to various markets. So the data was covering January to May, but since then we have data extending to December, and I'll be giving you a peek into what has happened since. You can access the brief. It's already in the academia website. It's brief number 13. So let me begin by basically saying that the war in Ukraine really disrupted global trade, and the impact of that has been transmitted to varying extent in various domestic markets across the continent. And maybe we need to ask ourselves, why is this important? Why do we need to be talking about this? I think Dr. Hamadi has mentioned that the main players in this conflict are big traders. 25% of wheat, 15% of maize that is traded globally is from Russia and Ukraine. They are also major exporters of fertilizer and energy products. And many countries in Africa, of course, rely on imports to meet the local demand. And even for those countries that do not trade directly with any of the countries, Russia, Ukraine, or even Belarus, the impact is felt through third parties. There are countries that deal with them directly, but they re-export. So if you look at the first brief in this series, the contagion effect is shown to be actually in place. And of course, we need to understand this because we need to take measures to protect the welfare of the people who are affected. And since the conflict is not so transitory, in fact, it is still ongoing, we expect these effects to continue to be felt even into the medium term. Hopefully that those issues will be resolved. So I think here, again, just to re-emphasize the issue of the indirect trade, and also more importantly, other aspects that are related to trade in terms of the increase in fuel prices that translates to higher shipping costs and also higher domestic transport prices, and also, of course, the reduction in the available supply. So in terms of data and method, we basically used weekly price data for selected basic commodities. We focused on rice, on sugar, on wheat and cooking oil. We also considered the fuel, petrol, diesel, and the liquefied petroleum gas or the cooking gas. The way data is recorded for this price data is recorded is that it is recorded 5 times in a month. So for the dry commodities, rice, wheat, sugar, etc., it's in Rwandan francs per kilo or Rwandan francs per liter for the cooking oil and the fuel. As I already mentioned, the brief already published focus on the period between January and May. But now we have data all the way to December, and I will be showing you what has happened since. The data is from the NISR and also the Ministry of Agriculture and Animal Resources. So we focus on 4 markets, 2 in an urban setting, 1 in Kigali and Musanze, and then 2 in rural setting, 1 in Kirehe district and also Nyamagabe district. And what we were basically trying to look is how the prices were changing on a weekly basis and trying to compare those with the changes that were being observed at the global level, either of the same commodities or sort of their close derivatives, if you like. And the global prices are recorded on a monthly basis in the World Bank Commodity Outlook. That covers about almost 50 commodities. So basically, we are trying to see how these price changes in this local market, both in the urban and rural areas, to what extent are they reflecting the observed changes at the global level. So as a way of background, we probably all know that Rwanda relies on imports to meet its demand for wheat, for rice, for sugar, and for cooking oil. Sugar is mainly imported from countries in the southern region, but also some of it is obtained from India. About 60% of the consumed rice in Rwanda is imported. Bulk of it, half of it is coming from Tanzania, but also others as far as from Asia, Pakistan, etc. The 60% of the cooking oil as well is imported. So therefore, with this level of dependence on imports, whether from within the region or globally, then we anticipated that these changes in the global scene would be transmitted to the local market. So here I have put two graphs side by side. One is the weekly price as they were changing from the first week in January to the last week of May in Kigali and also in Musanze. What we notice is that there was some notable increase in the price of most of these commodities. And if you notice, as I mentioned, the crisis set in, or the invasion was around the fourth week of February. So you notice that from beginning March, the prices began rising. Some became sort of flatter in the month of May. So and there are some reasons for that. By the time this crisis came in, about 49% or about half of the wheat consumed imports into Rwanda were actually coming from Russia. In 2019, about almost 180,000 metric tons were imported from Russia. So within a very short time, there was, an increase in price that was even noted in the local media. For example, a 25-kilo bag rose from 20,000 Rwandese franc to 25,000 by March, when after the crisis. And it's really, you can see that is partly attributed to that crisis, because even after that already, the government was taking measures looking at alternative sources of wheat imports, because the crisis was affecting the imports of wheat from Russia and Ukraine. At the same time, we noticed, sorry about that, in the urban markets of Kigali and Musanze, those really substantial increase in the price of wheat. The same for sugar and also for rice as well. But we noticed something interesting about cooking oil, though there was an increase in March and April, but by May, the prices had actually come down again, although as you will see in the next slide, I think, which now covers the period beyond May all the way to December. Overall, when we compare the prices at the beginning of the year in the first week of January and what those prices were by end of December, the sugar prices had increased by about 12%. The wheat flour price had doubled per kilo. The rice was about 47% higher, and also cooking oil about 18% higher than it was. So overall, beyond the initial period that we covered, there seems to have been an increase that was continued over the subsequent 6 months or so. Now, when we look at the other markets that are more or less in the rural setting, the one in Kirehe and then the other one in Nyamagabe district, we notice a similar trend in the increase of these prices. But some interesting nuances here and there. In Nyamagabe, we noted that the wheat prices went down from about 900 kilos in Rwandese franc per kilo in January to about 700 in May. And upon a bit of inquiry, we noted that the district is one of the wheat producing areas in Rwanda, and that could be a local effect of change in supply because maybe of the local harvest taking place there, which sort of tampers the impact at the global level. Okay, sugar also rose quite highly in both the markets, and also there was a slight increase in the price of cooking oil, though in Kirehe it was about 1% compared to 9% in Nyamagabe, and the price of rice also rose by 22% and 15% respectively in Kirehe and Nyamagabe. Now, when we looked at what has happened since May, the last week of May, all the way to December, you see the prices continued to rise more or less with very little changes in between. But the price of sugar going up by about 34%, wheat flour 41%, rice 56%, and cooking oil about 14%. Now, we then turn our focus again on what is happening with the fuel prices. So as I said, we are looking at the liquefied petroleum gas, diesel, and petrol. So as maybe many of you would know, or some of you would know, that the prices of these commodities are sort of regulated by the Rwanda Utilities Regulatory Authorities, and they are reviewed. By the time we were doing this study, they were being reviewed after every 2 months. And therefore, because they are regulated, you just need to look at one market, because the price would be more or less the same across the country. So we noticed that there were some changes, some increases in the fuel prices, as you can see there. But already, because of that crisis, or before actually that crisis, the government had decided to stabilize the prices of petrol and diesel by foregoing some taxes on the imported petroleum products. Let's see. Okay. So, and the rationale was that since the fuel play an important role in driving the economy, allowing the prices to rise uncontrolled would really lead to a generalized inflation, and also decelerate the speed at which the economy was recovering after COVID. So the prices of fuel remain relatively stable. There were 2 rises instituted in the month of the first week of March, and then later in April. But generally, the prices have increased by 11, 20, and 27% for petrol, diesel, and cooking gas, respectively, over the period that we were looking at. So we took the liberty also to check, so the remaining part of the year, what happened. And as you can see, there has been a rise in these prices for cooking gas. By the last week of December, it was up by 19%. Diesel was up by 39%, and petrol by 30%, compared to the prices that were prevailing in the first week of January. So in general, then we can see that there has been a general rise in prices of basic commodities, and also of energy. And I think this is also confirmed by the general inflationary pressure that have been reported for the country. So we tried to compare this by what was happening globally. Remember, I mentioned that we were looking at the prices of these commodities, how they were changing at the global level. So by end of May, compared to January, the price of wheat had risen globally by 40%. We see that being reflected in Kigali, for example, where the price had increased by that 6%, and in the rural areas by about 26%. So the global change in the price of sugar was more modest, but in the country, it was rising even faster. Remember, I mentioned that the bulk of the sugar is coming from the Southern African countries, and there might be additional dynamics that makes this price go even higher. So for cooking oil, I did mention that compared to what was happening at the beginning of January and what we observed by end of May, there was a slight dip in the price of cooking oil in Kigali, and just a modest increase in Kirehe. But by December, I have highlighted on the right there that those prices had actually increased by almost by 18%. So this was maybe a small decrease over time, but generally by the end of the year, there was actually an increase that could be compared to what was happening globally. Now, in terms of fuel, so here the global price is only reported for the crude rather than the refined products in terms of diesel, petrol, and others. So, but by that time, the global price had increased by 31%, and we saw price increase of fuel products for diesel 20%, for petrol about 10–11%. And we already said that there was intervention by government, which was foregoing some of the taxes to ensure that this price was not rising as much. The same we noted for the liquefied petroleum gas. The rise was very much almost reflecting what was happening at the global level, 28% increase and 27% increase. So, okay, so in general then, without maybe going back to each of the points, from this quick analysis that we did, it appears that there's a strong transmissibility of changes in global prices to local markets, both in the urban and rural areas, so that then it implies that the country is vulnerable to international shocks like those. And therefore, it is important that local policies and strategies that can help dampen or reduce the effects of such shocks are actually instituted within the country. And therefore, I think this basically is a summary of what we already have observed, the general increase in prices of these commodities. And when the commodities, basic commodities that are consumed by poor households, when their prices begin to rise, then it is a concern for the government to make sure that the welfare of the people are protected. So, and what we are proposing in terms of the actions that need to be taken, the short-term solutions is to continue to provide some targeted social protection supports, especially to the poor households that are facing higher food and energy prices. And this coming on the, just following the COVID-19 crisis, the government had already instituted some measures that were meant to cushion the poor and the vulnerable against the effect. So basically continuing with such measures in the short term is important. But more long term, I think we have to look, of course, outside and beyond the country, because these issues cannot be dealt, all of them comprehensively at the country level. And therefore, at the regional level, issues of facilitating freer intra-regional trade, especially for food commodities, is very, very important. You already saw in the earlier slides, for example, 50% of rice that is consumed in Rwanda comes from Tanzania. And therefore, when we trade more freely among ourselves, we can help each other's countries to ensure that we cushion ourselves against the global shocks. But in the long term, also boosting local food production and productivity is very important, because we can't control what other countries out there decide to do to one another and affect us. But there are certain things that we can do by increasing our production locally, so that we are less dependent on them, and more importantly, also trade among ourselves. I think the issues of energy are also important. Thinking about more energy saving, more energy efficient technological innovations, adopting those is important, especially because for energy, we are really dependent very heavily on the international market to supply our energy needs. And therefore, we need to think about how do we become more energy efficient? How do we have alternative sources of energy that will reduce our dependence on external sources? So agriculture is very important. Continue to invest in it as the country has been doing, so that we increase local production and reduce dependence on external actors. So I think I'm coming to the end of the presentation. These are the references. This is the first brief that I mentioned. The others that people can be able to see on the Academia website. So I thank you very much. And I give it back to the moderator. I think I have used 23 minutes or so.
Yes, thank you very much for keeping the time. I think I used less time, so you took my 2 minutes from the introduction,
Okay.
which is okay. So I think we are on the point. I think you have made a good case. You showed that the commodity prices in local market have increased. You showed also that the commodity price at the global level have increased. You provided some policy insight and also some recommendation. But before we go further, let me just make maybe 2 or 3 comments. The first comment I would like to make is on the issue of data.
Yes.
You have about 25 data points. If I may recall, because you mentioned data point from January 1st to May ending, with 5 data point collected per month, so which is 25 data point, which were later on completed by the recent.
Hello, Hamadi? Can you hear me?
Excuse me, can you hear me?
Yes, we lost you for a couple of seconds. Could you just take your remarks all over again, please?
Okay, sure. No, what I'm saying is that I would like to make a few comments. Just on the data first. Yes. You have 25 data points. 8 of them are before the crisis, and the remaining are after the crisis. And they are on prices. The first question or comment: are those data enough to basically to drive all the narrative that you have made? That's the first question and comment. The second one is that when we look at data point over time, usually in economics we refer to them as time series. So when you have time series data and you want to analyze them over time, there was a specific technique that we use, because in a time series, or when you look at a data point over time, you may have some issues that are due to inflation that has nothing to do with a crisis, just an inflationary process that is going. So it means if you want to correct for inflation, you must use what they call the consumer price index to deflate the data. So my second concern is whether this has been done, because this also can influence or impact on basically your finding. My third one is that the way you presented the narrative is that there is a causal relationship. Ukraine caused what is happening in Rwanda. But you also mentioned in your presentation that you were at the tail end of COVID. Because you were at the tail end of COVID, it may be that the effect of COVID on supply chain were just continuing. And that may be the story that you are saying may or may not be related to basically the Ukraine crisis. So these are the three comments I want to make, but I'm not asking you to react to them now. Let's just see whether we can maybe give the floor to the participant so that we can see also whether they have some other concern or they have some comments or some contribution to make. And then we give you the floor at maybe after 2 or 3 other questions. Is there anybody who want to ask a question or who want to take the floor?
Hamadi, there are no hands raised for now, and I don't see any questions in the Q&A. Perhaps Paul can address those 3 first, and then
okay, sure. So then let me give the floor then to our presenter, and thank him also for the quality of his presentation. And Dr. Gutiga, you have the floor.
All right, so thank you very much, Hamadi, for those very important and insightful comments. And this is a debate that we had when we began working on this series. And by the way, just to inform you, before the Ukraine crisis came on board, we had been doing something similar on price analysis, looking at the impact, whatever impact that Ukraine may have, COVID may have had. And we took the approach that you are describing. So basically, a sort of a comprehensive time series analysis where we try to go back, I think for Rwanda from 2010. And we were trying to control even for seasonality, because of course, without a doubt, these prices would be expected, even without a crisis, to be varying. Remember, I gave the example of the wheat prices somehow going down in Nyamagabe district, which we are trying to attribute maybe to the local harvest. For us, of course, to be able to say whether that is exactly what is happening, we certainly needed very long-term data. And then we try to control for seasonal effects, the normal seasonal effects. We had done that in the just before this crisis came, in the period, COVID period, and we published a number of briefs that try to take care of that. But more importantly, we were also using the time series to sort of predict or project into the future to look at what would be the expected prices, given the historical trend in the prices. What would be the normal expected price, say, of maize in Kigali in January or February, given those long data points? So we were cognizant of that, but this crisis came rather abruptly, and we said already, as you know, policymakers have to make decisions sometime, and there is no time to do a lot of comprehensive analysis. So we said, okay, in fact, as you can see, we only had like 5 months, as you've said, 25 data points. But we said, is there anything, even if we cannot be able to very comprehensively give a causal relationship, is there anything we are seeing in terms of the changes in the prices in the local markets compared to what we are already observing in the global market. So I think your comments are well taken, and it will be part of the discussion that we will have, because this is something we are still thinking, even now with more data. Is there something more comprehensive that we can do, trying to control for everything else, so that we are able to more strongly establish a causal relationship? But your points are very well taken, and they will inform our discussion going forward.
Okay, there is one comment made by, I think it's Tite. She basically raised a question on the input price. She is wondering whether, in your analysis, you looked at the impact of input price, like fertilizers, on the commodity price market.
Yeah, so thank you, Titi, for the question. Not in this study, but there is another brief on fertilizer and inputs. I think that was published by Usman and Won-Wosen, that focus on the inputs. I can't say right off now whether Rwanda was one of the countries that was considered, but there is another brief in the series that was looking at the input side. But a number of briefs, this one included, were looking at staple commodities and energy. But there is another one that looked at the price of fertilizer and other inputs, I think, but not this one.
Okay, I think Dr. Laye is saying, Dr. Laye, can you take the floor and just raise maybe the question that you want to raise?
Sure, thank you. So Paul, thank you again for your presentation. I know that you've also conducted similar studies in Kenya and Uganda. And yes. I'm wondering if you see any similarities, I mean, studies on the transmission of price shocks to local commodity markets in these countries. Do you see any similarities or patterns in the commodities affected? And what about government measures? Are there any, do we see any similarities in how measures the governments have taken to lessen the shocks in the countries? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Lai. Yes, it is true. We have undertaken a similar analysis for Kenya and Uganda in the Eastern Africa region. And the patterns are not different. They are more or less the same. For the period that we were looking at, we noticed that in general, the prices were increasing, and the pattern was not very different from what was happening at the global level. The measures that were being taken by government, I can say for Kenya and Uganda, especially on the energy side, the government decided to sort of take a different approach to remove the subsidy, if you like, that they were providing on energy. And I think there's a lot of that by many countries that are actually unplugging the initial support that they were providing by foregoing taxes and subsidizing the price of the energy commodities, petrol, diesel, and cooking gas. The arguments are, one, that it is very expensive and you cannot sustain it in the long term. It's running into billions of local currency, and it is not something that is very sustainable for a very long period of time. The other one is that it is not also very efficient because the targeting here becomes very important. You don't want to subsidize sections of the society who can afford. And for commodities like, petrol and diesel, it is very difficult to, especially if you are already doing a generalized one, rather than where you target and say, okay, go fuel, and then gets refunds. I had somebody mentioning that that's what they were doing in Ethiopia, where whoever is buying pays the full price, but then applies for refund from government. That makes it targeted. You can target who to give the subsidy. But if it's a generalized one, it's very expensive, it's not very efficient, and it can't continue for a long time. So I think that is what I can say. Otherwise, in terms of the general patterns, they are very similar.
There is just a comment that was made indicating that there is a slight decline in fuel price and certain commodity price in 2023. Is it a part of an overall trend, or it is just also another spike?
Okay, so thank you, Seraphine. I think I know that Seraphine had shared some data. Do you mind inviting him to give us a little bit of context?
Yeah, sure. Seraphine, can you take the floor?
Seraphine,
since you made that comment?
Come up and...
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you, Amadi. I was just noticing that I was looking at the regulations issued by the Ministry of Agriculture in Rwanda. You can see that the price of fertilizer has kind of declined from just a few coins, like 100 francs, from the season 2023A, that was way back in August, this season. So the farmer is going to pay something like 100 francs less, which is a good when you're buying 100 kg fertilizer. So this seems like a good news for the farmer, but I was wondering if this good news is going to continue, if the outlook is positive. Yeah, that was my question.
Okay, so thank you for that information. I don't know. My question may be to you, Seraphine. Does the government of Rwanda provide subsidy on fertilizer? Or not? And is this decrease in price maybe as a result
excuse me, can some of the people who don't have the floor mute themselves?
Yeah.
There is like a background noise.
Yes, there was a
Thank you.
background noise.
Go ahead, Paul.
Yes. Yeah, so I was responding to Seraphine and indicating I can't say for sure whether this decrease is something that we continue to observe into the future, likely, because we already see some adjustment, at least at the global level, some adjustment are already happening in terms of some agreement at the very high level among the warring parties and those that are involved in the conflict to at least allow freer movement of grain, okay? Although the region, of course, the Black Sea is very volatile, we, of course, with an offensive expected in the coming spring, it, of course, is very volatile. So I don't know how much of grain or fertilizer will continue to flow freely from that region. Because again, even within the domestic situation, it's very dangerous, less power, like in Ukraine. So I don't know whether even the factories that manufacture fertilizer would be really operating at the capacity they should. So at least looking at it from a global perspective, I don't see how we would expect a really quick decrease in the prices. But at the local level, depending on what governments do, either providing subsidy, looking for alternative sources for importing fertilizer, that is not something we can be able to to say with a lot of certainty what will happen. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, there is, I think I see Julie Collins who raised her hand. Julie, you have the floor.
Thank you, Hamadi, and thank you, Paul, for your presentation. I just wanted to ask about the impacts on food security of the prices, of the price changes that you've been talking about. I know it takes a long time for these data to come available, but in Rwanda or also in the other countries that you've worked on, are there any preliminary data or studies or even case studies of impacts on food security of these price changes? Thanks.
Thank you, Julie.
Yes. Do I respond to Julie first? Okay, so thank you, Julie, for the question. I must confess I haven't come across a recent study yet on the food security situation. What I know for Rwanda, there's quite a lot of information, I think, on the inflation, the general inflation, the food inflation. It's being reported to be among the very high ones. And by implication, that would erode the purchasing power of the households, and it would work its way to affecting the food security. But I can't quite say at the moment, or don't have any data of that I could make reference to. But by implication, I think it's likely to affect the food security situation. But I would say in the region in general, because the Horn is experiencing sort of a weather crisis where we are coming from a very long drought period. So Kenya being affected quite a bit, and other countries, Somalia, Djibouti, I think parts of Ethiopia, etc. So I think in a way that is going to work its way already into a situation where there is less food, and the food security situation is likely to worsen, because there are a lot of people in the region who are already dependent on food aid. So in general, that's what I would say. But for the specific case of Rwanda, I don't have a case study that I could make reference to.
Thank you, Paul. I think we have another hand that is raised. I think it's Fatima Karim. I think she wants to ask you a question. Fatima, you have the floor. Unmute yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Yes, thank you also to Paul for the very nice and wonderful presentation. I was following your presentation, and in most of your figures, I could see some rises in the prices of the commodities that you considered in the study around February ending, or maybe in the beginning of March. Prices started rising. However, towards the end of May, I could see, for instance, the price of wheat and other commodity, they started stabilizing or taking a downward trend. I was wondering whether you have some explanation for this. Although you mentioned that you are engaged in another or a further study where you are going to look at further prices and study the effect of that. I was wondering if in your further studies, the prices are also stabilized or are taking a downward trend. Nevertheless, I also have a curiosity regarding the case of wheat and edible oil, for instance, because in Rwanda, we could see that wheat and edible oil are not the staple food. They are not the main dominant staple food in Rwanda. We have bananas and cocoa and cassava being the staple food. And I was wondering if, because these products that you considered are not the main staple food of Rwanda, that this might affect how quickly the prices will adjust following the exposure to shock. So if you can shed more light on this behavior, or if you have an explanation to this, I'm curious to hear. Thank you again. Over to you.
Paul, before you answer to this question, let me just make sure that for the sake of time, because you have 10 minutes left, that also you answer another question that is in the chat box, which in my view would be the last one. It's a question from Seraphin. He's asking whether the drop in oil prices as observed be due to the fact that the poor household tend to spend more on other vital foods. And this is exactly similar to the question that Fatima is raising. The commodities that you focus on are not the main staple food of Rwanda. Whether maybe this is also impacting maybe the quality of the study that you conducted. So over to you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Fatima. Yes, and your observation is correct, because I did say that we observed that by May there was some leveling that was happening after the initial increase from the first week of March through April. Sort of the prices began leveling. So out of curiosity, that's why I continued to look at what was happening thereafter from June onward to December. And I did report that even some of the initial flattening and leveling of prices did not persist for long, so that by the end of the year, we were observing that the prices had modestly increased, of course, varying from one commodity to the other and by market, but generally the prices continued to increase. Now, on the question of whether, and I think this is an important one, wheat, edible oil, and this being not the main staple. So what informed first our choice of commodity? We wanted to have a glance into commodities that are mainly sourced through imports. If, for example, we had focused on a commodity like maize, maybe the prices would probably have remained relatively stable because the country doesn't depend a lot on imports of maize. In fact, in the recent past, the amount of maize produced has been on the rise in Rwanda. I also think that cassava, given its very low level of tradability in the region, we would probably have not seen, I can't say, maybe it's only a hypothesis, because but I would not expect the price to change very drastically. So we sort of focused on a set of commodities that the country depends mostly on imports to meet its local demand. And it's also important to note that over time, the consumer dynamics do change. So the levels of consumption of wheat products, be it bread or other related food products, especially in urban areas, are also increasing, and even the consumption of oil as well. But you are right. The reason why we focus on this is because the country depends more on imports, and we wanted to see whether the crisis was having an effect on those prices.
Paul, one final thought in 1 minute. What is a takeaway message from this study?
The main message for me is that our economies and our countries are not very much shielded from what is happening globally. And our progress in terms of even achieving food security, securing the welfare of our population is also being affected by what is happening far away and where we have very little control. So I think our policymakers need to think broad, not just local, but also have their eyes on the changes in the globe and how they are likely to affect our country. And rather than be reactive, it is good to anticipate and plan for it so that we are not caught flat-footed. I think the COVID crisis, the Ukraine crisis following each other like that tells us something, that we need to think global much as we act local and know that what is happening out there does affect us.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. Let me just maybe get my final thought before we conclude. We have 5 minutes. I think from the presentation, you showed that a similar trend exists between what is happening globally and what is happening locally. Although I'm not sure, and I put in bracket, I'm not sure whether we can say there is a causal relationship. We just observe two patterns, but we don't say one causes the other. So in my view, because we don't have that causal relationship also, I'm not sure whether we can push to some of the impacts that you mentioned. Although you were very clear that it's too early to tell based on the question Julie raised, the impact on food security are not known yet, or you have not seen any study that address those issues. So the second message I'm taking from this discussion is that the commodities that were analyzed are not the main staples of Rwanda. And because they are not the main staple of Rwanda, this may also indicate why some of the prices in some regions were not aligning to some of the changes. The third message I am taking from your presentation is that some similar study have been done in the region, and you indicated that those similar studies have shown some results where the pattern are similar, and then the policy that was enacted was basically to absorb the shocks by foregoing some of the taxes, etc., etc., etc. Now, in terms of moving forward, in my view, I think we will benefit really significantly in terms of looking a longer data series. I have to say, having an academic background and having done even similar type of work, published in peer-reviewed journal way back in my academic life, I am pleased to realize that countries like Rwanda collect data on almost a weekly basis. And because those data are available, we need to really take advantage of those data and do maybe a long-time series type of analysis on them, because that's where you can really uncover the structural implications of this kind of crisis, because the data will show. My economic professor used to tell me that if you torture the data enough, they will confess. So you will have a good story. So let me end here. We have 1 minute left, so that I can leave the floor to Dr. Laye to close the meeting. Over to you, Dr. Laye.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amadi Job. Thank you for interrupting your vacation for us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your stay in Indonesia. Thank you to Dr. Paul Maina-Guthiga, our presenter for today. Thank you so much for being part of this series. And thank you to all our attendees. Thank you for an interactive conversation. Please come back here same time next week, 1 p.m. GMT, and we will be headed to Malawi with Dr. Gunro Machaya to discuss the transmission of global price shocks to local commodity markets in Malawi. And that session will be moderated by Dr. Shahir Zaki, Professor of Economics at the University of Cairo. Please go to the chat. We are sharing links to our slide share where you can access all the PowerPoint presentations from this webinar series. And of course, visit our Ukraine crisis portal at academia2063.org. Thank you all. See you next week. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamadi.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to log out from my phone. It's not letting me log out. You see?
Okay, we'll just end the meeting.
Okay.